All right, coming up next is our panel, Leading from Where You Stand, Change in Organizational Transformation. The discussion will center around what intersectional activism and leadership can look like inside and outside the workplace. Moderating the panel is Aidan Curry, Executive Director from Ramba. We also have joining us panelists Louis Ng from Fidelity, Bryce Saloto from Swarm Strategy, as well as Nikki Take from Mercer. Welcome.
Everyone, can you hear me okay? All right. My name is Aidan Curry. Get settled. I'm the executive director at Reaching Out MBA, otherwise known as Ramba. I identify as a gay, white, cisgender man. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm Irish Canadian. I live in Atlanta, Georgia at the moment, but I was actually born here in London, and I'm super thrilled to be back. This is my first time out of the country since the pandemic, so I can't imagine a better place for that to happen than EUROUT. I think this is my third conference. I think it's a really wonderful conference, and I think the organizers make it look very easy, which is a very difficult thing to do, especially this year in this virtual hybrid model. So are there any organizers here in the room? If you could just stand up for a second. Anyone? All right, I just want to give you all a round of applause. Yeah, you really have done an amazing job, so congratulations on another great conference. A little bit about Reaching Out MBA. It is an organization been around about 20 years. It's a peer organization to EUROUT. And it started with some students getting together in 1999 saying, there's no place for LGBT plus MBA students to network. So about 100 people got together. And now we got about 2,000 people coming to our conference every October. We got over 100 corporate partners. It's 3 days. We do programming throughout the year. We started a fellowship program about 5 or 6 years ago. Started with 14 schools, and now we've got coming up to 70, and we give out about $6-7 million a year in scholarships to LGBT MBAs. We have 4 fellows here from Imperial College and London Business School, and we continue to grow. So if you're going to be in the States, if you know anyone in the States who's interested in getting an MBA, getting their MBA, or even post-MBA, please come and find me later. We have a lot of great programming and would love to discuss with you. Right, so here today we're going to be talking about leading from where you stand, change in organization transformation. And I'm really excited. I think this is such an interesting topic that I'm definitely going to be stealing for next year at Ramba, and a very timely one. I think, when you get a little bit older, you get more perspective on just how fast the world is changing. I was talking to my niece and nephew recently who are now like teenagers going to high school, and explaining to them how, back in the day when I was in high school in the late 80s, if you wanted to meet your friends, you had to actually pick a time and a place, and if you wanted to be really high tech, maybe use a payphone, but that was, you were either there or you wouldn't. And they were looking at me like I might as well have grown up in the 1850s. I mean, it just seems like a totally different world. And I mention this because I think, technology has changed so fast, and it really has informed how the next generation thinks about, gender, about identity, about DE&I, and that kind of informs this conversation today. I think I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists in a moment, and I think, in terms of the goal for this session is to hear their insights and experience about how they've been able to be leaders and impact change through the course of their careers. But I'm also excited to hear from everyone in the audience here, your questions, but also your comments and perspectives, kind of in the spirit of this panel. This is really about, kind of hearing from people at all levels of an organization and seniority. All right, so why don't we get started here? I will say, I should say I'm kind of pinch hitting here as a moderator. The moderator, Pavlos, unfortunately was unable to make it. So I've not yet had a chance to meet our panelists. So we'll all go on this journey together. And panelists, if I mispronounce your name or anything, please forgive me and correct me. And I'm gonna just announce you with your name and title, and then when I ask the first question, if you could, talk a little bit more about your experience and yourselves, that would be great. So we have Bryce J. Stiletto, who is the founder and chief Jedi officer of Swarm Strategy. We've got Louis Ng, senior manager, early careers talent acquisition at Fidelity International. And we've got Nikki Take, who is the head of growth at Mercer. Right, so as I say, I'm going to ask the first question. If you could take a couple minutes telling us a bit more about yourselves, panelists, and answer that question, that would be wonderful. So how do you define leadership in the workplace? And Bryce, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, of course. Hey, folks. Thanks for having me this morning. My name is Bryce Stiletto. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the founder and chief Jedi, which is just a cool acronym that stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion officer at my business, Swarm Strategy. I launched my company about 18 months ago, really to support organizations, both nonprofit and for-profit, so for-profit businesses with DEIJ work, racial justice, but also obviously LGBT workplace inclusion. I am someone who is Black, I'm queer, I am transmasculine, and I'm also connected to different LGBT kind of service and advocacy groups, similar to EUROUT, similar to Roomba. So I'm a Point Foundation scholar and alumni, which is an organization here in the US that supports LGBT college students and graduate students. I'm also based in the South. I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is my hometown. And before launching Swarm, for the last 10 years, I have worked across LGBT advocacy at different national, state, and local organizations, such as the National Center for Transgender Equality, GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, also been a board member at several of those organizations. So I did that for 5 years, pretty heavy LGBT policy and advocacy work. And then during graduate school, I'm at Brown University, which is in Providence, Rhode Island. I did some diversity, equity, and inclusion work for the education department at Brown, which really was my first formal introduction, if you will, to doing DEI, although I would say my LGBT policy work obviously intersects there. And I'm also actually a former high school history teacher. So I love that you shared that story at the beginning, Andy, about your family members. And I definitely would say, being a former high school history teacher, my issue area focus was really like ethnic studies, American history, African-American history. And I bring a lot of that into DEI work in terms of the way I approach it, in terms of the way I facilitate workshops with clients. And I've actually found in the business space, clients they're really drawn to the fact that I'm a former high school history teacher. And that's the reason why some clients have actually hired me, they told me. So that's a bit about me and kind of how I got into this work. And I love this first question about leadership, because I think so oftentimes when we think about leadership, we really think about it, especially in business spaces, it's oftentimes defined by your title or your role or your seniority level or how long you've been doing something. And my approach to leadership is really a bit different. I really think that leadership isn't about any of that, quite frankly. It's not about your title. It's not about your role. It's not about how long you've been doing something. But it's really about the way you work with people, the way you treat people, and the way you think about these issues, right? Especially when we're talking about DE&I. And I think particularly for folks that are LGBTQ, who are people of color, who are immigrants, who come from different marginalized backgrounds, we're told so often throughout our careers, and quite frankly in education spaces, right? When we're in college and grad school, you were mentioning, Andy, why y'all started Roomba to begin with, right? Is because there wasn't space for LGBT business students, right? And I think so often that's the case, right? So in leadership roles, I think there's not space for us a lot of times, and it's kind of up to us as young LGBT people to really define what leadership means to us. So, I think the last thing I'll say about that before I pass it on, because there's so much wisdom on this panel from these other panelists, is that to me, effective leadership is really about being people-centered, right? So in order to effectively lead and manage people, you really need to know who they are, right? So if you're leading a team, if you're leading a project, you need to know who those folks are on your team. And I don't just mean their names and pronouns and where they went to school. I mean, like, what are their strengths, right? What do they really bring to the table? What are some things they need extra support with? What are some challenges they have? A question that I always ask folks when I work with them is like, what is your learning style, right? Which again, I think in corporate settings is not something people think about, right? It's very much like a school thing, an education thing. And I think like that's one way I show leadership is like kind of asking those questions about folks to really get to know them. Because then if we're working together, you know, if I know someone, for example, is a visual learner, they need slides, they kind of need those graphics to really understand what's going on, then I'm not just going to present a lecture to them for an hour, right? Because I'm going to know that they're not going to get that most likely unless there's something visual for them. So just asking those questions, getting to know the folks you're working with, and really being able to identify problems too. I think that's the last thing I'll say. I think being a good leader, what separates good leaders from great leaders often comes down to, you know, are you able to look at something, look at a project, work with a client and be able to say, hey, like here are the top 3 priorities that I think your organization can work on, right? When it comes to Jedi work, or when it comes to racial justice, or when it comes to LGBT inclusion. So I think those are all traits that really make up good leaders and kind of some of the ways that I think about leadership.
That's great. Thanks, Bryce. A lot of elements of emotional intelligence in there, which I'm looking forward to digging into more. Thank you for that. Lewis, to you next.
Sure. So just a big quick intro. So my name is Louis from Fidelity International. I'm based in Hong Kong. So I'm Chinese by origin. So my pronouns is he, him, his. Basically, I am openly gay. So my day job, probably I interact with a lot of you in the room. So I'm a recruiter by nature. So I basically run global MBA program for Fidelity across Asia, UK, and Canada. So I'm sure I will have lots of opportunity to engage with you. And if you're looking for opportunities, we can speak afterwards as well. Beside on my main job, I do a lot of the diversity and inclusion activities at Fidelity. So I'm part of the LGBT plus strength, where we have a global team looking after kind of our progress in the inclusion agenda at Fidelity. So I have been doing that for the past 5 years at Fidelity, but actually I started doing this when I had my first financial service job back maybe 10 years ago at World Bank of Scotland. I think now it's NatWest. So I've been doing that for quite some time and very experienced with running employees resource group and trying to drive the change with the endorsement from the senior leadership team. And I think this is definitely something I'm really passionate about, and I'm really proud to have opportunity to work with so many people, both at the firm and also externally in the community, to help to progress for better equality for our community. So I think I agree a lot of what Bryce says about the leadership. I think I probably have just one thing to add on. I feel like it is quite important. It's about role modeling. To me, a lot of the people, not necessarily people at the executive level. I mean, anybody can be a role model. I think it comes down to what story they could tell to really share the story and trying to influence and raise awareness on some of the very important topics in the community. Because especially in Asia, while a lot of the time is quite a taboo to talk about various LGBT plus topics, and having someone like myself, especially who are local, openly gay Chinese, are very, very more difficult to find. I think things are getting better, but in a way, having both model is quite important. I think our objective is not to ask people to come out, but in fact, it's just to make people more comfortable, so that they know they have the support when they need. And we're doing the thing not to encourage you to come out, but in fact, just making them to be who they are, especially in the workplace, because I've seen people who struggle because somebody in a team were saying some very things to discriminate particular team members, and that particular team members felt very uncomfortable about it. And that's why I think not necessarily we support the LGBT plus community, but also having role model plus having people to be allies are such important things in the in the community itself. And I think this is the real kind of leadership we should be aiming for, in my opinion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lewis. Nikki, last but not least.
So, hi, my name is Nikki. I think I double the average age of the panel. I'm pretty certain if you took Bryce and Lewis and added it together, I'm still older, but there you go. So I'm currently in an interim role in Mercer, usually based in London, although right now I'm in New York, but also my first trip out of the country. It's quite interesting. We pushed us past each other on midair in the Atlantic. I have my own consultancy practice called M62, which I started 27 years ago. What we do at Vincis, M60 Vincis, is help people win big contracts. So I'm a sales coach. Most people win 1 in 3 of their deals. My clients all win 3 out of 4 of their deals. So I double or treble people's chances of winning. And I tell you that because I'm a coach, basically. And I think when we get onto a conversation about leadership, I'm going to talk about coaching. Just one point, you'll notice I don't have my pronouns on. I don't have my pronouns because I used to be a boy, but I'm okay now, so that's fine. And I have a bit of a counter narrative around pronouns. Like I love the fact that my team all put their pronouns on their emails, because that's them telling me, I think, that they're okay with the fact that my pronouns have changed. But I deliberately don't put my pronouns out, and I don't tell people what my pronouns are. Like, it took me 90 minutes to do my makeup, figure it out. And when people say, what are your pronouns? My response is, well, it's up to you. You choose. Like, but bear in mind, your choice says more about you than me. And everybody listening will judge you based on the pronouns you choose about me. And frankly, I quite like to know where the arseholes are in the room. Knock yourself out. So I'm based in Mercer at the moment. I've been here for about 2 years throughout lockdown. I manage the growth team, which is about 60 people who, and our job is to get the business to grow, obviously. And I sit on the management team of the UK Wealth Division, and we have 4,500 employees in the UK, revenue of about 650 million. If I do my job, 670 million this year. And that's kind of what I do. So leadership. I think often people confuse the difference between leadership and management, right? And they are 2 completely different things. So when I get my leaders together, when I get my team together, the first thing I do is I give them something that I stole from Disney, which I think is worth remembering, particularly if you're, starting off in your career. And in the parks at Disney, when you do whatever it is you do, kind of sell Coke or sell ice cream or whatever, you do the thing, and they teach you how to do the thing. But the day you become a supervisor, they take you out the back and give you a kind of education about your new role. And they sit and they say, the only thing that matters now that you've got people who work for you, your job entirely is daily R: acknowledgement, recognition, and encouragement. So all you have to do every day is watch your employees and look for the thing that at the end of the day, you're going to go, Bryce, thanks for that, mate. That was really good. I love the way you did. The way you handled that client today was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. Keep doing it. Well done. And if all you do as a supervisor or a manager is every day tell the people who work for you, well done, thank you, this thing that you did for me was brilliant, then they will work harder for you. They will enjoy their job more. They'll get more out of it and put more into it, and everything gets better. As a species, human beings don't often look for the stuff that's good. we have a tendency, because it's easy, to look for the things that's wrong. And we have a tendency to respond to people always saying, well, I didn't like the way you did this. And, you know, you could have done this. And I didn't like this. And I didn't like that. And you should have done that. And you didn't do this. And criticizing is largely the domain of the fool. It takes a wise woman to actually spot what people have done well and praise them. And that's the essence of coaching. My job as chief coach in all 4 of my businesses, my entire job is to watch what people are doing, find the good thing that they've done, compliment them, reward them. And if they're doing something wrong, create a scenario where they do something different. And when it works, I can jump in at the moment and say, well done, do more of that. And I think if you're looking for a definition of leadership versus management, be the coach.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Nikki. And just a quick note, if somebody has their phone on, it keeps popping up. So if you wouldn't mind just putting it on silent, that would be great. Thank you. All right, so let's get into the meat of this. I think this is kind of really one of the central questions of this conversation because, you know, I think a lot of people kind of think that shaping company culture might be part of a senior leader's duties. But culture can in fact be shaped by those who are not at the very top. And so how, you know, in your view, does one become a change actor regardless of their position in an organization? Bryce, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I love this question because, you know, actually, like in every organization I've worked at prior to starting my own business, I was this person, right? I was the entry to mid-level employee that was kind of the one taking initiative to be a change agent, if you will. And I was never in a senior position anywhere I worked while I was doing advocacy work. So this is a really personal question for me. And I think there are 3 key takeaways here. The first one is like know your audience, right? And with that, like your messaging for different audiences, right? So if you're talking about equity work, if you're talking about inclusion, if you're, you know, for example, trying to get your organization to do something with pronouns, right? To have a policy about pronouns in your email, or if you're trying to get your organization to host a panel event like this, right? And you're like, oh, how can I do that? Know your audience, right? Who are you talking to? So are you talking to executives and senior leaders, or are you talking to middle management people, right? Because honestly, I'll tell folks, you know, if you're in an entry-level role in an organization, your best bet is building those really strategic partnerships. And the way you do that is by having really targeted conversations with middle managers. I think there's this misconception in diversity, equity, and inclusion work that, you know, that it starts from the top, which it does. That part alone is not a misconception. It definitely does start from the top. But the misconception is that, you know, they are the ones, they being senior leaders, they are the ones that are implementing the work, right? They are the ones that are on the ground doing the work. And that's not the case, right? In most companies and organizations, the folks that are actually responsible for implementing and really ensuring that the company is following along with diversity initiatives is middle managers, right? So if you're in an entry-level role, your best bet is to really like partner with folks in those roles, in those levels, because they're the ones ultimately responsible for implementation. So I think knowing your audience and who you're talking to is really key. The second thing I'll say is do your research, right? So this is something that, you know, I'll give an example of really quickly. I worked at a nonprofit in California a couple of years ago, and after a couple weeks, quite frankly, working there, I noticed pretty immediately that the organization had different equity issues. And it was a small nonprofit. It was only like 20 to 25 employees probably. And, you know, I just after doing some observations and kind of experiencing a few things myself, I was like, like, I think there are like some equity challenges here. So, you know, me being a very new employee, I wanted to talk to people on the team who were more experienced, who had worked at this organization longer. So, you know, I had some conversations with folks that had worked at this place for 5 years, 10 years, even more in some cases, and asked them like, hey, are you also seeing these things? Like, is this only me? And they were like, no, no, it's not only you. Like, yes, this has been happening for a long time. And I was like, okay, cool. And I asked someone who's in a management role, I was like, hey, do we have any data about diversity, equity, and inclusion at the organization? Like, has anyone ever done a report? Has anyone ever come in and done a demographic survey? And I actually found out that like a few years before that, I worked there. The organization had done like a DEI audit, and I got access to that data and just like kind of sat with it one night and took some notes and like wrote questions based on this report from a few years ago. So, I would say doing your research is also really helpful. If you can access that kind of information, whether it's hard data or even just the insights of employees that have worked there before you or have worked there longer for you, that's really key. And then finally, this kind of goes back to the first thing I said about knowing your audience a little bit and messaging. The way you do that, the way you know your audience and the way you figure out kind of, okay, how do I talk to a VP about this versus how do I talk to a mid-manager about this is by making connections with those colleagues, right? And again, especially folks who have more institutional knowledge about the company or organization than you do. And one way you can do that is like participating in ERGs and BRGs, right? So employee resource groups and business resource groups. I think those provide really strong opportunities, especially for entry-level employees who are just starting their careers, just coming into a company to kind of take on larger leadership roles or to take on the role of a change maker, because oftentimes in ERGs and BRGs, obviously every company is different, but typically in an ERG or a BRG, there are different roles. There's like a co-director of the group, right? There's like an administrative person in the group who takes all the minutes for the meetings. So there's different ways that within that ERG and BRG, you can become more active, you can become more involved, and again, start building those connections, which I think is honestly the most vital thing you can do as kind of like a young person starting your career in an organization if you're looking to make change.
Yeah, that's great. I love the idea of talking to middle management, because I think a lot of people have in their mind, we all know kind of leadership comes from the top, and so the idea of walking into the CEO's office and having that conversation, but there's a lot in between those people who are kind of in the trenches and doing a lot of the work. They're a very important part of the equation. Louis, I'd like to come to you next. If you have any additional thoughts about this, and I'll add a little bit, any thoughts on what the company as a whole can do to empower people, at a more junior level to be a change agent? Because I think more and more that, given how different, kind of generationally people are thinking about, especially DE&I, I think that's a really critical kind of step for success.
Sure. I think Bryce had mentioned quite a lot of points. Especially I want to highlight around the ERG. That's how I started in the first place. So I must say, from the Asia perspective, depending what company that you work in, my career has always been financial services, and we throughout all my career, I had the opportunity to join different ERG in the organization. But I do know for the fact that smaller company or more local company, these things won't even exist. But that doesn't stop people from being a change agent, right? So I would say the couple ways you can tackle. So depending how open your line manager would be, I think from as a new joiner, you probably could sense that whether your manager is open to talk about general diversity and inclusion initiative, and leveraging your line manager could be one way. If not, you can network around the organization, because there are people who definitely would be interested in the topic. And if your organization is more behind in terms of agenda, what I can suggest is there's so many events going on in other organizations, and sometimes they welcome external kind of parties to join. And sometimes it's good to maybe pick some of your colleagues or middle level managers, like Brian said, to go to really understand why is it important that we do such kind of LGBT plus inclusion, why it matters, and just start something small. If the ERG is much easier, because when I first joined Fidelity 5 years ago, there was no LGBT plus strength, and I actually started about 3 weeks later after joining, because I had the experience before, and I thought we should be able to get one. in a big organization, I would agree that we need a lot of data, and these data may not be readily available. So sometimes a lot of the nonprofit organization may have some insight that you can, through different research paper, like in Hong Kong, we have community business, and I think in the UK, there's opening the business, those type of things. They have the data that can show some of your management or managers why this is important. And often, in organization, you have to pitch it as a business case, because essentially it's not just about your employees, it's actually relevant to your clients, the wider community, your suppliers, and everything. And if you're able to do that, it takes guts to do that, because obviously if you're a new employee, you probably want to do your job, you want to keep your job safe. But because I think a lot of us are very passionate about topics, I think when you're new, you have a fresh pair of eyes on organization, you probably can see what are some of the opportunity out there to help to drive the inclusion agenda. And it's not something you do overnight, right? It probably takes a couple of years. I remember when in the first 2 years, I probably just did a lot of awareness stuff, trying to making sure we talk about the general basic, going back to the 101, going back to people don't understand what allies means, and what are some of the local jurisdiction, like part of the homosexual behavior in Singapore, actually it is illegal. People don't know about it. So I think sometimes going back to the basic and then try to educate people around it. And I feel like the younger generation, because I deal with them a lot. In fact, they're pretty open in terms of being supported. I think you just have to tell them as part of your onboarding, these are different community that you want or networks that you can join. I mean, it doesn't have to be LGBT plus inclusion. It could be just a sports team, or maybe just a volunteering team, and different options for them to choose from. And I think it's good for them to navigate and try to find the group that they're really passionate and interested in. And that's what we are trying to do as that. And we as a group, we do have a lot of people who are more at the junior or mid-level, trying to drive the change. And I have an opposing view. The leadership team, for me, is more an endorsement and also doing some more important kind of sign-off, because a lot of the time at Fidelity, our structure is quite flat. If you have ideas, you have things to go through, they allow you to do that. And with the senior management to give you maybe financial or kind of getting you to the right meetings to get those approval, I think that's a good thing. But it doesn't happen to every organization. I think some organizations have to take through 10 different layers of approval before you can do something else. But unfortunately, at the organization that I work in, it's pretty easy for us, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Is something that we cannot just do on our own. You probably need to leverage of each other. And because another point is around leveraging your HR as well. Because I'm in HR, so I'm a little biased, but I think a lot of the HR pretty changed to help push agenda, and it's part of our job and passion to do that as well. So you can talk to someone HR. I'm sure that will help to talk to you, and depending whether there's an existing or in DNI as well, you can talk to those team as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Louis. Nikki, I was going to move on to our next question, but if you have any final thoughts on this that you want to kick off with, but I'd love to hear, a story about some time in your career when you were an agent of change.
Okay. I think that'll be my entire career, but so I
lots to pick from.
Louis just reminded me of a joke. I also do stand-up comedy. I perform all over the world, 300 fringe shows, blah, blah, blah. So at the risk of breaking your house rules and telling a joke, Louis just reminded me of an actual genuine, I used to live in Singapore, used to be a PR, kind of loved the place. The first time I tried to get into the country as Nikki, I had this very bizarre conversation with the immigration officer who said, "Do you always dress like this?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you'll have to come to the little room and kind of prove to us that you've got a legitimate reason for being in Singapore." And so I said to him, I said, "Is this because you normally you see ladyboys? And he said, yes. And I said, and so normally ladyboys in your head are all prostitutes? He said, yes. I said, so you're asking me to prove that I'm not a prostitute? He said, yes. But apparently offering to sleep with him for nothing was not proof. I don't know whether that punchline landed. I can't see the audience, but there you go. So it is a true story. I also had the bizarre, like just whilst we're on it, coming out of South Africa, where the immigration, I don't know why this was coming out, but it was coming out. The immigration said, like, excuse me, miss, but there's a problem on your passport. I said, well, what? She said, it says M and it should say F. I said, oh, that's very, that's very cute of you, but I am genetically male. It's right. She said, well, you'll have to prove to us that you're male. I was like, sorry? Like, how does that work? Like, do we do it here? Or are you going to take me? I mean, she said, well, no. She said, no, you need to get an affidavit from the police saying that you're that you're female and that your passport will catch up with you eventually. It's like very bizarre. It was about trafficking they were worried about. Anyway, so back with the question. I wanted to make a comment because I'm sort of assuming I've got a predominantly queer audience. So with apologies to the straight people in the room, I do tell another joke on stage about what's the phrase that we should use to describe people who are not LGBT. And I know it's cisgender heteronormative, but that's kind of, I think the correct word is boring. Yeah. So obviously it's a queer audience. You're all laughing, right? So I have a spiel I give sometimes about how I think LGBT queer people in general, we have a superpower, and the superpower is this: straight people. If you take a good hard look at their social circle, right? If you go to a dinner party with a straight couple, chances are everybody around the table, plus or minus 3 years from each other, are all the same age, right? They've all got the same cultural references. They all listen to the same music. They all go to the same restaurants. They all do the same stuff. They're all homogeneous. Like typically, most of their friendship groups are also the same profession. So you find out, my wife's a doctor. Like all of her friends are doctors, and all of her friends are doctors that went through med school the same time as her. So they're all kind of in their 50s. They're all kind of, homogeneous. Would you go to a queer dinner party? There's none of that. Like you can have a 22-year-olds, 53-year-olds, kind of people who are in professions. The guy who's the binman, like sat next to the guy who's the DPP, and it's generally a much more eclectic and, to my mind, much more interesting group of people. So if you're queer, you're so used to being in a diverse environment that I think sometimes it's easy to miss how difficult it is for people who are not used to diversity to get them to feel comfortable with it and to leverage it. And that's our superpower, is that we can do it. And I've got a tip for you, and two tips. Firstly, let me give you an analogy to help straight people understand what DNI is, because they don't understand it. Like they don't kind of often get it. So my analogy is chicken soup. There's a long version that's on my website if you want to hear the funny version. But essentially, diversity is going to your fridge, opening the fridge and finding you've got all the ingredients to make a chicken soup. Inclusion is getting Gordon Ramsay to come around and cook it for you. And the reason it's a good analogy is when you say to the chicken soup, what's the most important ingredient? The chicken, straight white men, will say, well, chicken, obviously, it's chicken soup. So obviously the chicken is the most important ingredient. But if you ask a chef, the answer is salt. Like without salt, chicken soup is bland and boring, or chicken curry is bland and boring and not interesting. But with salt, all of the other flavors come out, and all of the complexity of the sauce gives you the great dish that it is. It's the smallest component, but it makes the biggest difference. That's inclusion, right? Inclusion is making sure you find the salt in every business meeting, in every conversation, in that, look for the salt constantly. So now here's the tip. When you're in a meeting, it doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what your position in the organization is. You can do this thing, and this thing will help you find the salt in every interaction you have in the business and will make a massive difference to inclusion. And I think only queer people can really do this because we're the only ones aware that there's a problem, right? And it's this. the start of every meeting, write down a list of all the people that are in the room. Now, actually, I teach my salespeople that you do it around the table so that you're using a mnemonic to help you remember who everybody is. But just however you do it, list of people, everyone who's in the room. And then when you hear that person speak about anything, you just hear their voice, just put a tick next to their name. By the end of the meeting, you should have heard everybody speak. Right? If not, you need to do something about it, whoever you are, because the salt may be in the person who sat at the back and kept their mouth shut because they're too junior to open their mouth. Right? Number one, hear their voice. Number two, put a second tick when you hear them express an opinion. So not just, yeah, I agree with Bob, because, you know, that's not really helpful, right? So what we want is, you know, what bit don't you agree with Bob, or what bit can you add to Bob? Like, you know, so how do you think that would work? So use questioning techniques to try and draw people into giving you an opinion about it. Double tick it. If you get to the end of a meeting and you have 2 ticks next to everybody's name, well done. You made sure SALT was in that meeting. And you have, by definition, made the workplace more inclusive. And nobody else, including the chicken, noticed. They just realize eventually you're getting better source when you are in the meeting, because you're doing something they're unaware of, which is listening, which is not a skill straight white men are good at, in my opinion.
What can I say? I mean, that was an amazing illustration. Thank you for that. That's going to stick with everyone in this room. Time is flying here. So Bryce, before we go to Q&A, I'm going to give you the last word. You know, panelist choice, either, you know, a quick story about a time you've been an agent of change, or advice to anyone who might be struggling in finding a way to be that agent of change in their organization.
Yeah, I'll kind of do a little bit of both really quickly, hopefully, because I definitely want to hear questions from the audience. And Nikki, yeah, that was really, really beautiful. And I actually want to add on to that a little bit, because that was like reminded me of, I was taking a lot of notes while you were talking, Nikki. And I think I would agree with like what Nikki said about like everything, kind of, right? Like my identity like has really driven that necessity. So thinking about like when have I been a change agent in an organization, like, yeah, I think everywhere I've worked, because of my identity, like I've had to, right? Like if you just think about who I am. So in my trainings and workshops, when I'm doing kind of like my entry level identity and culture DEI training with different organizations and companies, you know, I talk about core identities. We all have core identities, right? So for me, my core identities are being Black, my core identities are being transgender, being queer, and also something I didn't mention at the beginning is I'm neurodivergent, right? Which for me means I'm on the autism spectrum, and I also have ADHD. So if you think about those 4 things on their own, being Black, being trans, being queer, being neurodivergent, right? Like companies and organizations are not made for anybody who has those identities, let alone someone like myself who has all 4 of them in one person. So, you know, like because of that, like I have had to be a change agent in organizations. I've had to speak up. I've had to be the one kind of organizing meetings. I've had to be the one, you know, leading workshops and trainings, even though it wasn't in my job description. Because if not, quite frankly, I wouldn't have survived as long as I have in a professional setting, right? And I love that Nikki brought up superpowers, because this is actually something me and her talked about just one-on-one in our pre-conference call, was about trans people specifically, how I really, really, truly believe that like transgender people have a much higher sense in general. This is obviously a very blanket statement, but trans people have like a higher emotional intelligence and a higher like EQ, which I think in the workplace and in business settings, you know, for the very few of us that get into these spaces, is I want to emphasize that, right? Like there aren't a lot of transgender people who are doing the work that, you know, we're talking about on this panel. And that's not because they're not capable. It's not because they're not talented, because obviously folks like Nikki and I, you know, misprove that every single day. It's because, quite frankly, most trans people don't get the opportunities, right, that they should get, simply because of their identity, right? And so I say that to say, you know, Nikki's mentioned the superpower aspect of identity, right? And how that plays into being a leader, how that plays into, all this workplace DEI stuff that we're talking about. And also funny because in that introductory training I do with clients as well, I usually give kind of like pre-work to my clients. And there's this TED Talk by America Ferrera, who's an actress, if you're not familiar with her, famously from The Sister to the Traveling Pants, which was my teenage like crush movie. Anyways, America Ferrera has this beautiful TED Talk called My Identity is a Superpower. And I make all my clients watch that video as part of like a workshop and trainings. And one of kind of like the icebreaker questions I ask folks to kind of start off that training session is like, hey, what part of your identity is your superpower, right? And it doesn't have to be your gender, your sexuality, your race. It can be something as small as, I've had people say things like, oh, I'm a mom. And I think in the workplace, that makes me a better listener. That makes me more empathetic, right? So it doesn't have to be like necessarily like your LGBT identity. It can just be anything about your identity with superpower. And funny enough, a lot of my participants who are straight or are white or come from predominantly mainstream identities really struggle with that question, right? And I get a lot of feedback like, oh man, I've never thought about that before, or I've never thought about it like that before. But once they watch the TED Talk, once I kind of lead them through that conversation, by the end of that, 15, 20-minute part of the workshop, and I really want to build a session one day where all we do is that, but that's like a dream one day. But the end of that part of the workshop, people really they get it, right? They get that like we can harness parts of our identities in the workplace as a superpower. So I think I'll just really briefly close by saying, if you're someone in an organization that's kind of struggling to make change, know a couple things. One, you're not struggling because you're not doing a good enough job. You're likely struggling because you're running up against power structures and systems that have been ingrained into companies and organizations, corporate culture, and quite frankly, if you're in the US culture for 400 years, right? So kind of a joke I make in my workshops and trainings, but it's not really a joke, is, if I'm doing a workshop, for example, on anti-racism, and it's a 2-hour workshop, I tell people like, hey, in 2 hours today, we are not going to dismantle 400 years of white supremacy and systemic racism in the United States, right? Like that's not what we're here to do because we cannot do that in 2 hours. So I think if you're in an organization, you're running up against kind of like challenges, roadblocks, know that one, it's not about you, right? It's about these power systems that are in organizations that are just like so challenging to fight up against. Two, I would say find areas where you can make immediate changes versus long-term changes, right? So whenever I'm doing like a long-term DEI plan with a client, and I'm at the very beginning of that process and I'm just doing an outline for them, I kind of break things up into 3 buckets. What are some short-term goals? So what can we change in the next 1 to 3 months? What are some medium-term goals? So what can we change in the next 4 to 6 months? And then what do we want to do this organization to create change that's going to take more than 6 months, right? And being really realistic with myself, quite frankly, but also with them, and being really honest about kind of what can we do now, intermediate, long-term. And then finally, I would say, and some people have touched on this throughout, but I'll give like a really quick specific story, is finding allies and accomplices in this work at your organization is so critical. So one client that I worked with for about a year actually is a major international beauty brand, which if you told me when I started my business that one of my biggest clients would be like a cosmetics and beauty brand, I probably would have laughed in your face as like a trans man who grew up a total tomboy with no interest in any of that stuff. But that's neither here or there. But I bring this client up because they were a multi-billion-dollar company, hands down the biggest company I've ever worked with. And it was actually pretty early on, like right after I started my business, they reached out to me and I was like blown away that they even wanted to work with me. And one of the people there who really went to bat for me and really went to bat for the work I was doing at the organization. And I was working with one internal person at their organization who was an incredible Black woman. It was just me and this one Black woman doing all this DEI work for an organization that had hundreds, if not thousands of employees. And the senior VP, she was a middle-aged white woman. She's cisgender, to my knowledge, my best knowledge, she's straight. So, straight, cis, 40-year-old white woman, she really went to bat for me and my work. And we still stay in touch. And she's a senior VP at this organization. And there were times where we definitely hit roadblocks, whether it was scheduling challenges, right? Whether it was funding issues, whatever you want to name it, we probably hit that challenge. And this particular VP just always advocated for us and would talk to the CEO and say, hey, no, we need to make time for this. We need to make money for this. We need to, and the CEO was on board, don't get me wrong, but oftentimes, there was still that disconnect sometimes. And this particular VP kind of filled that void. So I would say, find those people who are there to support you, because they are there. I know sometimes it feels like there's no one in your corner or it's just impossible, but I promise you, there's always one person who really does believe in you, believes in this work, and has the power to support you.
Wonderful. Thanks for finishing us off with that, Bryce. I know we're running into lunch. Folks, any time for a question or? One question, anyone? Got one here.
Wow, I can see the audience.
Try that again. Thank you. All right. So I guess for me, I've observed oftentimes, we say about this comparative advantage that queer folks, other minoritized individuals may have in leading DEI work in their organizations. But what I'm curious about is how do we create incentive structures or use influence in organizations to get everybody else who may be not signing up for the DEI committee, who may not understand the importance of DEI, to be actually taking on those behaviors in their day? Because I think there's a problem where we see the people most impacted taking leadership, but then everybody else is kind of like sitting there. And how do we bring them into that in a meaningful way?
So can I answer that? I'm jumping in. I have a plan for that. I think the problem is we try and approach allies and allyship in quite if we're not careful, quite a corporate way. And so, we have lunchtime meetings, we get 3 of a kind on the stage, and we ask the allies to come, and then kind of, the 3 trans people on the stage talk about how hard it is to be trans, and the guys at the back sit there and kind of go, it feels kind of a bit uncomfortable. What do you want me to do about it? And they might be well-meaning, but it doesn't really help them. So I have a specific project we're running called Laughter Gets Better Together, LGBT. And basically we run a comedy show on a Tuesday night in London, and we invite our ERGs to bring their allies out for a drink. And it would start at 7, so it's nice and early. We bring them out to the pub and tell them some jokes and have them have a good time. And then when they've had a few drinks, we run an improv session where we talk about the stupid things that cis, straight, white men often say to us, and then use the comics to put some humor into how would you handle that. So somebody in the audience might say, well, I'm lesbian, and I was in a lift the other day and some guy said, you're only lesbian because I haven't kissed you, right? And I didn't know what to say. And then we give it to the comics, and the comics go, you should have just leant in and said, yeah, your wife said that last night. And what we've done is we've made him feel a little bit stupid about saying something stupid, but we've done it in a nice way, but with a sense of humor. So, obviously, bring them all to the show is a good idea, but I wasn't trying to promote the show. I was trying to promote the idea of if you can make them enjoy your company, you win. Like if they want to spend time with us, they want to come. Like I've had people who, this is the first time they've ever been in Soho, ever been in a gay bar, ever been out in our world, and been blown away by it. Like they had no idea Soho existed. They had no idea that we're out having a good time, enjoying ourselves. They had no idea that actually we're quite like them. We're just having more fun. And if you can bring them in and show them, what you might find is that they might figure out how to help. And I make it very poignant at the end of the show. I say to the straight people in the audience, you've had a good time, you've enjoyed it, you've been at a gay bar for the first time in your life and nobody's tried to sleep with you. Like, guess what? You're not that attractive. No, what's really important is you've heard some of the stupid stuff we have to deal with, and you've seen us try and approach it with a sense of humor. Your job is to advocate for me when I'm not there. When you're in the lift and you hear two guys say, oh, the new girl's joined, I bet she's a lesbian, like, you have to step in and go, well, you better not let her see your girlfriends and had your boys. Make them feel stupid, and advocate, be there for us when we're not there, or where we don't feel like we can have a voice, like be our voice for us in the workplace. And we're teaching them how to advocate for us with a sense of humor. And I just think, laughter gets better together. Like, they'll bring them in and have a laugh. And if you can make it fun and make it enjoyable, maybe you can also make it impactful.
And I know where time is an issue, but I just want to really quickly add to that. I love that, Nikki, and I also love the play on the acronym. And I think within an organization, a lot of that, in terms of the day-to-day is, I think the way we talk about DEI work oftentimes, or the way other folks talk about DEI work, is really problematic, because they talk about it as if it's like an extra thing, right? As if it's like an add-on component, like, oh, like, this is like a side project, or, oh, like, we do this work and then DEI is on the side. But like, no, it really is, it is and should be ingrained into every single like level and department and component of an organization. And I also think really emphasizing that makes a huge difference, so that way people think about it differently. So instead of it being an extra thing, it's an integral and essential business function, is what I will say. So the way you kind of hone that message home is through your day-to-day conversations, is through messaging, is through looking at data, and really getting people to understand that it touches HR, that it touches programming, it touches finance, right? Something I say a lot is that budgets are moral documents. How you're allocating money, to what teams you're allocating money, who is leading those teams, what kind of external projects you're allocating money to as a company, that all shows your values and morals. So while you might not think about DEI as a finance function, it very much is. And it's also a marketing function, right? Especially if you're doing outward campaigns or advertising. So a lot of my work actually with that beauty company I mentioned earlier was like, I supported their marketing team in terms of creating LGBT inclusive campaigns, right? So it's about understanding that DEI is not just like this own little pretty thing you can put the cherry on top of, right? It really is the core foundational function of every single component of your business.
Might be
Bryce,
the salt of your strategy.
There you go. Bryce, Lewis, Nikki, I want to thank you so much for your time and insights today. Nikki, I definitely want to see your show next time I'm in town, so I'll be in touch. Thank you all for being part of the conference today. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Great.
Should we catch up, Bryce? Bye.
Yes, bye.
And I think it's lunchtime now, so.
Thank you, Aiden. Thank you, Nikki, Bryce, Lewis, especially for joining across different time zones. We really appreciate you joining us today.